and welcome to the Truth in Data podcast, where we tackle a new digital forensics topic each week. My name is Jessica, and with me I have,
Hi, I'm Kim.
And I'm Debbie.
and we are just so excited to be able to spend some time with you today. Today's topic is a really hot topic this week. There were several artifacts that have come out across the last 2 weeks related to this topic, and it is timely acquisition of evidence, or acquisition is preservation. So I'll kick it off with Kim. Why don't you give us a little intro to what we're talking about today?
There are a lot of artifacts that don't live forever on our devices. So when it comes time to us doing an examination, the method and the timing of your acquisition could really play a part in what you have to examine.
That's a good one. That's one of many of these reasons, right? And I'll tell you that I've been working cases recently where we did not have the location data we'd want on iOS devices because cache locations only last 7 days. And that is an argument that can reduce the amount of data both for exculpatory and inculpatory evidence, right? But those aren't the only artifacts. So what I really dug is that it is more than just those artifacts timing out. And I really appreciated the paper that the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence put out. I mean, full disclosure, I'm a member of the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, but they put out a position paper, which is kind of rare for them. They only put these out every once in a while compared to the vast number of documents on how to do digital forensics or best practices. And the position paper states that in order to preserve evidence and get the most complete image, we have to do it in a timely manner. And what I really like about that paper is they cite a couple of different cases that are outside of the digital evidence realm to really help drive that point home. Debbie, did you have thoughts on that?
I read the paper and I thought it was stellar. I was so excited when I was reading it because coming from a law enforcement background and writing search warrants and reading and approving search warrants that other officers wrote, trying to develop new language really for this new problem, because I think that's what many of them are going to have to do. I thought that there was great language in the paper, and I was thrilled that they cited cases that really made sense. And like you said, they didn't necessarily relate to digital forensics, but I'm a big believer in, okay, so there's no clear path for this particular problem. So we have to take into account the intent and the spirit of the law when we're reading former decisions. And I think in the paper they cited some of these so that it gives law enforcement guidance as they are navigating this new challenge.
I'm going to point on something you said. So you used a word that I know was never mentioned in that paper, and it's the word search, right? Because one of the concerns today, so we've got these 5 reasons when we think about it that we need to acquire quickly, right? It's not just the loss of data that Kim mentioned. It could be dead man switches. It could be remote wiping. It could be AFU, BFU reboots. It can be USB restricted mode. There's all of these reasons, and they're well talked about in the Forbes article as well as the article from Forensics Mag, and I'm sure we'll touch on those later. But at the end of the day, none of these pieces talk about the word search. And I think that's really key because currently there's a difference between, seizure, I pick up the device, and acquiring the data. And depending on what jurisdiction you're doing digital forensics in anywhere in the world, what that qualifies under is going to be different. And I think the argument is that as long as we can't see any resulting artifacts in that transmission, that really is just preservation. Because if we wait until we have search, we may have lost our complete ability to actually do that acquisition.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, 100%. And I think I'll back up just a little bit and say, because when you acquired the device, there was, a lot of times when we are acquiring devices, it is through consent or it is through a search warrant.
Mm-hmm.
So you're seizing the device, and then yes, we're talking about acquiring the data for preservation. Some jurisdictions are going to want that spelled out in a legal document. And I think that some of the language, even though we're not saying it is a search, it is acquisition and is preservation. I think that arguing that is going to, some of the language in the position paper will absolutely come in.
Well, do the tools do what they need to do on that side to really support it not being a search?
Right. And I believe you talked about that in a recent article.
I did. So the answer is yes and no, right? So some tools have come out with versions that won't show any unique identifiers or any information about the device. But a lot of the vendors who didn't are working on that. And I've actually spoken to them. I mean, I was at the Magnet User Summit last week and they addressed it in the executive keynote. And then I had a conversation with Chad Gish, who is also part of SWGDE, that hey, when is this going to come out? And they said very, very, very soon. That's in work where their collection, but Celebrate already has done that and put it in there. But that's, again, not the only issue, right? There's so many issues here, right? There's technical, there's legal.
There's budget issues.
There's budget issues, yeah.
So if we are saying that you need to image or acquire a device as soon as possible, there are agencies that don't even have that ability in a lab, much less on scene. And so it's going to be changing, some of the mindset of law enforcement executives as well, to where they may have been resistant for a digital forensics capacity. They are going to really have to have one, at least to acquire the evidence.
So here comes the question: who does that imaging? Who's qualified? Who is qualified to actually make that on-scene extraction? One of the other elements that we haven't touched on yet, and I know we should probably take a moment to examine these different use cases, is that with some of the stolen device protection features, you really need to make the acquisition near a home or recognized location, which means, again, acquiring at the scene, or maybe even bringing the device to a physical location where that user resides. I mean, there's a lot of unique instances here with the reboots. Those on Graphene OS, those can be set as short as 10 minutes till the device actually reboots. And for folks who maybe are less familiar, we can, with modern commercial forensics tools, obtain a fair bit of information when a device has been at least logged into once since its last power on event. And that's called AFU mode. And if the device is on but has not had its passcode entered since last reboot, that's called BFU, or before first unlock. Some people call it a cold device, but there's less data availability. And when I say data availability, most user data is available to modern acquisition tools on modern operating systems without knowing the password. And to those of you who are out of digital forensics, please don't be scared. Nobody should be doing this without lawful access. That's the reason that we're mentioning these terms and when it can happen is because those people who are acquiring your devices are doing it within legal means, or they need to be, because if they're not, at least in the United States, it can't be brought into a court of law if the proper procedures weren't done and they weren't, the mobile forensic acquisitions or images weren't made at the right time. So that's the reason it's an issue. Otherwise, they'd be being made willy-nilly in the field. Anyway, we're not saying willy-nilly. We're just saying that we're losing exculpatory and inculpatory evidence. I was actually I'll leave him nameless, and I don't know the case that he was speaking of, but I know of an examiner who was doing work for the defense. An examiner who does work for forensic science, not for one side or the other, but in this instance was doing work for the defense recently, and actually cited the SWGDE paper in terms of saying that the acquisition wasn't done in a timely enough manner, and that was used to have the case thrown out. So it's important on both ends, from a defense perspective and a prosecution perspective, in both sides in civil, to make sure that we're obtaining the data or we're losing it.
Yes, I believe it's going to be a defense if law enforcement doesn't acquire the data in a timely manner.
So who does it? Who does the acquisition now?
This is where things are going to get sticky, and things are sticky around this quite from many different perspectives. But if you look at from the standpoint of, if there's a very large scene, if you will, and there are other things that need to be addressed prior to us even being able to get us examiners, or the examiner, the person who's going to do the acquisition on scene, whatever that is, you may have an amount of time in there where you're not able to get to that digital evidence. Or
100%.
The other part of that may be, depending on the agency, depending on their SOPs, depending on how they operate, or if you're an agency who doesn't have an examiner and needs to take it to a laboratory that's not close to where you may be, that may be just a matter of taking it. But then now we need to educate those folks that are in the field so that they're going to know the best way to preserve that, and kind of cut your losses off, so to speak, to make it as best as possible.
And it's complex, right? That's the whole reason that we're having these changes anyway.
And Kim, you know as well as I do that it's been a struggle. There are still officers on scene who don't understand they still need to leave the phone on. So we've tried to educate about that for years now. And as technology changes, it's hard for even examiners to keep up, much less the people who are seizing devices in the field.
Yeah, the Forbes article that Lars Daniels wrote, he speaks to the critical element of what people are used to being sufficient versus what is today. Because prior to now, everyone has thought, if I put it in a Faraday bag and isolate it from network signals, we're good, right? But that only stops remote wipes. That doesn't stop the dead man switch. That doesn't stop the degradation of evidence. That doesn't stop the AFU BFU reboot clock. That doesn't stop the data port being switched to a charging only port, so you can't attach a data cable, or what's called USB restricted mode. So the current best guidance, and the best guidance from the U.S. Supreme Court in the 2014 ruling on Riley, which was, we've got everything. If we put it in a bag, in a Faraday bag, all exigency issues are handled. Well, no, we totally have an issue of exigency now. So, the rate at which things change isn't relevant. There actually is a paper that just dropped today. So that Forbes article dropped today. A paper dropped today from DFRWS about preservation in general and dealing with rate of change. And that paper doesn't even address this particular issue, but is speaking in general about how we have to preserve data, and even more interestingly, test data as close to the incident as possible in order to get the most concrete. So now we're talking academic papers, articles in Forbes, SWGDE guidance, and this is all the last 2 months. How does, and Kim, just your thoughts, how does, from your perspective, being in a law enforcement agency, how do we even meet that rate of change? What's a state police agency or a local department supposed to do today?
There's always a challenge, and nowadays, it just gets a little bit more complex from a digital perspective. As technology increases, that just makes things a little bit more difficult. Fortunately, the younger folks that are hopefully our law enforcement officers out there that are coming up, they have grown up with technology, so this is a little easier in terms of understanding maybe the what we're trying to get at, or what the crux of it is, so that they can help from their perspective and understand a little better. And hopefully some of those are wanting to go into digital forensics. So that's one perspective of it. But then, I mean, there's always been something we've been chasing and haven't been able to keep up. You know, for years we kept saying, this is too much data. We have no room for all of this data. We can't take everything. I can't give you everything. You don't want everything, you know, right? Everybody was always asking us for everything, and you just can't give everything. They don't want it all. Trust me. But that's been a big challenge. So this is going along right with this. But I will say this, the SWGDE paper did a great job. And there was a sentence in there that I absolutely loved that says, technological advancements are inevitable and will undoubtedly drive further changes, impacting even more data types that could become unrecoverable. So this paper was very meaningful in numerous ways, but also saying, don't count this as your one and done paper on this. You have many more things.
That's the whole thing, right? Like, I was actually talking to Frank Edelstein and Hans Berkiger, I'm not sure I'd pronounce his last name, apology Hans, who wrote the DFRWS paper that dropped this morning in the Forensics International Digital Investigations. And everyone listening to us talking about all these resources that just dropped, they're in the show notes because we are so excited to be tackling this issue today. And at the end, they were like, this is like the sky is falling, right? But back in 2005, they said the sky was falling in terms of we have too much data. And then in 2010, it was falling because encryption is coming and we'll never get forensics. I remember being told forensics is dead in 2010 because of encryption. 15 years later, it's not, right? And then in 2015, locked phones, forensics is dead because of locked phones. And we're never going to get past them. We can't, unlock these devices. And now in 2025, in 2020, we were told the sky's falling because of cloud data and people being off network. And now this is just the 2025 evolution of it, right? That we have to preserve unseen and that we're losing data. It's this constant cat and mouse, right? And I agree with you, Kim, we just have to think of it that way, right? The sky isn't falling. It's just that we have to continually reinvent our processes, as we all chose an occupation that is going to constantly be challenged by technical advancement and modernity, which is awesome, right?
Right. And, I think another thing that I found very interesting, you mentioned before about the court sightings in the SWGDE paper. And one of the terms that was used when quoting one of them was, it says that there's I'm sort of paraphrasing, the standard of fairness to require that criminal defendants, I'll say anyone, can be afforded a meaningful opportunity. And that was the purpose of making sure that they are getting the very best evidence possible presented on whichever side of the fence that you're on here. I mean, we're all on the side of forensic science here. So right. That's what I think is huge, is this meaningful opportunity, and what it's our job as examiners to be able to find that best way to comply with the laws that we have, and to help those that are in the field to be able to know what the best thing for them to do is. If you are that new officer coming out, how difficult is that, Debbie? You've seen numerous new officers come out. How hard is that for you to be able to have them know what's, not just when they initially come out of their academy knowing what to do, but then what do you do on an ongoing basis to make sure that what they encounter on the side of the road, on something, they pull over, or what if they go to the big scene? I mean, anywhere in between. How do we end up? And that's kind of what Jessica asked me a moment ago, but it kind of comes back to that.
It's true. How do you maintain, updated instructions to line level officers or detectives or, investigators who are going to be seizing evidence, how to do it properly, and the importance of keeping it powered on, and now, trying to acquire the data quickly. It's everything from teaching it in basic training to continuing education to, but we all know too, that even if we did continuing education on digital evidence every in-service, every year, some of them aren't going to remember it. no one's going to put that in their in-service every year, because there's also so many other things to cover. It really is a challenge to try to educate continually on things like this.
But let's be blanket. It's not just forensics examiners who need to know this. We can talk about the fact, I gotta tell you, I'm so happy that the Forbes article came out, and I'll tell you why. The article in DFRWS, that's going to be read by academics. The article in SWGDE is going to be read by practitioners. The article in Forensics Mag is going to be read by a smaller number of practitioners, right? But when we talk about the Forbes article, do you know who I'm hoping realizes this? Regular people. People who aren't in this field, people who are going to argue for their rights, people who are going to turn over their devices when they realize they're in legal trouble on consent to their attorney, right? So now I'm talking, you've been accused of a crime, you're on the defense, or you're a victim, and this isn't your device is being seized, this isn't you're a suspect, this is you have information and you want to ensure either your best defense or you want to ensure your best ability to give information as a witness to a crime to help find justice and so that the right thing happens. And when that's a situation, I'm hoping that people will recognize now that, hey, every day a photo that you selected to be removed 30 days ago is losing its availability for recovery. Every day, cached locations on an iOS phone, yes, there are other sources of locations, but that being the most robust, loses data every 24 hours and only has a 7-day span total. Folks understanding that the data degrades, even if it's no choice of their own, that the phone will move from AFU to BFU. This is really big when there's homicide victims who are not going to be able to unlock their devices. And I would hope that their families would want the truth to be found and to ensure that things are known. So if there's a homicide victims don't share their passwords. They don't provide access, right? We get what we get. So I just think it's critical for the masses to be aware of this. So that's what's good about the Forbes article. And then I'll stress it's important for us to educate those in the judicial system who aren't spending their days like we do in the ones and zeros and in the weeds, but for legal professionals to really be able to understand digital evidence. And there are some who are amazing at it, and there are some that I work with, and it's just not their area of expertise, and that's okay, because law isn't mine. But there's not many programs out there. When folks go for the bar exam, they're not spending months learning digital evidence, right? It's just not necessarily part of their exposure. So then when we're saying, hey, yeah, this law exists, the 2014 Riley ruling exists, and it says that there is no exigency to imaging a phone and that you can't image a phone subject to arrest, then that is what they know. They know the legal statute. They're not aware of how the technology is changing at a rate, and most users aren't. Most users aren't going to know that update to 18.3.1 in iOS made a dramatic difference in our ability to forensically acquire data. So I think there's an education component. I agree to that, Debbie, and that it's changing. I'm just saying that it's not just the people who have to make the acquisitions need to know.
Yes.
It's regular people and the legal system.
It's judicial, prosecutorial, and even law enforcement executives. So if we are, say if it's the examiner and they're saying, I need these new tools, we need to change processes and policies, this is why, law enforcement executives need to be educated as well.
So in a perfect world with no limits on budget or personnel, would you train a field responder to make the acquisitions and get them certified and through training, right? Like budget's not an issue. Or would you take the forensics examiner out of the lab and send them on every warrant to collect? Which is
I'll tell you that I like, you can do either, but I like the first option. I believe you and I have talked about technician versus, a digital forensics technician versus a digital forensic examiner who is more skilled. I think that's a different discussion, but
For sure.
For budget, I know you said there's an unlimited budget.
In my scenario, which is not
yes.
a true scenario for anyone.
Well, now that I'm thinking, yes, it's not. Now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, if we could have the best trained examiners on scene every time, that would be amazing.
But they would lose their skills if they weren't in the lab doing exams. That would be my
concern.
They would
do that too.
Okay.
They would do that too.
The examiner still only has 60 hours a week. I joke because we know no examiner works only 40.
Well, our examiners came on searches with us.
Good.
And, Kim, you went on search warrants, correct? So, we did a couple a week. The rest of their time was spent in the lab. And I actually think both skill sets are, vitally important and for them to understand how things are acquired on scene. But I do think either option would be good. It's not happening. And I do worry really about the fact that agencies, first of all, aren't going to understand this fast enough. Second, they aren't going to have the budgets. Many of them don't even have a digital forensics component at all. And, they rely on state agencies or other agencies or task forces or, their neighboring agency to help them with digital forensics. And they're, throttled by their backlogs. And so, I do worry that there is going to be evidence that is missed that will, not only prevent justice for victims, but also may help someone prove their innocence.
100%. The Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence actually put out another publication this 2 weeks ago. It was a draft publication of the best procedures or processes for preservation and handling of digital evidence. In other words, what do you need to preserve, acquire, and handle evidence? And it's got some really good flow charts in there. And as you were talking about the technical merit of the different roles, I was thinking about that flow chart that's in that document. And I hope anyone who's listening to this, please go take a look at that document. It is in draft. It's receiving public comments today. Submit those comments. That it's a complex workflow, and that workflow doesn't go into all the tools and techniques you need to do those things. It's just the procedural order. And it is complex just from the acquisition. There's 2 diagrams, multiple paths, and then you add in new operating systems. What happens if I've got a graphene phone or a Harmony phone on scene and it's not Android or iOS? And it's complex. And we need people who are specialized and understand those things. I don't think just learning how to plug something into a tool is sufficient to ensure the highest level integrity of the highest order type acquisition that could be acquired in all circumstances. Not saying that data isn't data, but if we don't have the complete picture, we may be missing exonerative data. And that scares me.
We for years have been asked to paint the picture, right? And a lot of these artifacts that we're kind of talking about here, and we want this most complete representation of the evidence. And in order to have that complete representation of the evidence, we need to quickly get this acquisition, right? Preserve it so that we're able to get the best acquisition. And if we're going to use a lot of these artifacts, if you think about it, the more that the smarter our smartphones get, and the more features they get, we get more artifacts out of that, right? So I remember one of the first ones that I saw that was like a 1-to-1 almost, where you started to see some interesting artifacts, was when screen time came about years ago. And you were like, oh, that's so cool. And then I was like, oh, but let's go look at this data. This is really cool. And that was a really interesting first kind of look for me anyway, of when I first started to realize, holy smokes. So then every time that, we get a new feature, if you will, within, phones, we're like, okay, then what kind of artifacts does that mean for us? But that also helps us to paint the picture, right? That helps us to be able to see exactly or better what has actually occurred, which I think goes back to, kind of dovetailing in with that citing of they need to have the opportunity for the best evidence possible.
You just reminded me of something that's really critical, and that is we understand these concepts when we relate them in other digital forensics areas. No one's going to stop you from collecting memory on a live running computer because they understand that memory degrades. And now we look at some of the stuff that MSAB is doing, and they're getting memory on phones. They're sticking phones in freezers and then doing memory acquisitions and using that as part of a methodology. That is something that we can easily explain based on things that are known in digital forensics, that preservation includes acquiring the data from the phone, because we know that when we come across a live up and running laptop, we consider it preservation to pull memory. We don't go and say, I need another warrant because I'm seizing the memory. We seize the memory. So that is relatable, unless you're in a jurisdiction where that's not the case and you have to go get something else to seize the memory on a live and up and running computer. Then I delay my last, because I've learned one thing I've definitely learned over the years is every jurisdiction sees things a tad bit differently. Even when we have very high level rulings at the district and Supreme Court levels, it's how it's interpreted and how it's used in that jurisdiction. And, we're a global field. But at the end of the day, I think acquisition is preservation. And I know I keep saying that everywhere is more than that. And sometimes we don't even know what we're missing. I was doing a talk last week, Kim was there, and I asked the audience, I'm like, how many of you have lost data to a dead man switch that's gone off? The answer is you don't know. It is possible that a device that you've received that looks brand new and freshly rebooted, that it may have been collected in a state that actually had data on it. But a dead man switch has timed it out and that phone has been factory reset. So you don't know, right? Then you have to say that almost any factory, it's actually the same as in evidence, right? If you don't know, you have to put in the possibilities. So then you can say that any device that you've received factory reset might have been victim to a dead man switch without your knowledge.
That's quite possible.
Right? No one could answer that question, because no one will ever say, oh yeah, I received data that had a dead man switch that went off, because they literally would not know.
Right.
The only way is if you actually did make the acquisition timely and recovered the fact that there was a dead man switch installed and that it had something like a 4-hour delay. That's an uncomfortable delay. That just means your user's very tired, because they'd have to wake up every 4 hours and unlock their phone.
Yeah.
So hopefully they're doing at least 8 for their own sleep cycles. But yeah, I think it's just a critical issue. And I feel like it is reaching the masses. I feel like between all of these papers this month that it is. So now the question is, it's one thing if we all write about it. It's one thing for us to all preach it. But can you legally do it? Maybe.
It goes back to our age-old, it depends.
I will tell you that if I was still in law enforcement and I was making those decisions, I would say we are going to do things as properly as we can, interpreting the laws that exist in case law, and I would do it. I would absolutely. Because I believe that there is legal precedent to justify that. And I know we're talking semantics, but I wanted to ask I know search is a different term than seizure. So to me as a law enforcement executive, you are talking about acquisition as preservation. It is a seizure of that data and not necessarily a search. And so and you were talking about different jurisdictions, I believe to put in a legal document, a search, what we call a search warrant, but it is,
for sure, yes.
it is seizure
It's used
in
for seizure.
search. So, seizing that evidence and using a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of these cases that were cited in SWGDE, the SWGDE position paper, and talking about educate. We used to educate in our search warrants, so that the judge would sit there and read, and we would talk about seizing the device, searching for and seizing the device. We would also talk about searching for and seizing the data. Searching the data is different, but I do think that adding some of this language to search warrants for seizure of this data will absolutely help our arguments when they are possibly challenged.
And that's what's so great about the academic paper, the position paper from SWGDE, and these articles is they are armament for our legal professionals to
Yes.
be able to utilize, reference, cite. Maybe the articles less; those are more for awareness. But the SWGDE position paper and the paper that just came out from FSI, although it's not specifically about mobile, it's about this whole concept and cites it. I think it's really good. So how much fun was this, getting to chat about these issues?
That's great.
It was fun. We're nerdy, so it was a lot of fun.
So what's really cool is, we talked about this, and Kim, Debbie, and I have each had shows in the past. And what we wanted to do was do a show where we're going to deep dive a hot button issue in digital forensics each week. So we hope you've enjoyed this first episode, and you'll at least get one of us on each episode. Having the three of us together, it's probably going to be a rarity based on our travel schedules. But that's really the cool thing here is you'll get some of this team each week helping you learn more about truth and data. Thanks, everyone.